I've been using this Fujifilm X100V as an everyday carry camera for the past 3 years, and I really do think that it is the perfect camera for documenting your life. However, I feel like straight out of the box, some of the settings just don't make sense, and especially if you are new to photography, this can be really confusing. So today I thought I'd make a video explaining all the settings that I use that I feel like are perfect for this camera. However, I'm very aware that these won't be the perfect settings for everyone, so I'm also going to explain what they all do, explain what the different options do, and if you feel like the settings that I use aren't right for you, you can choose the ones that you feel like will make the most sense. So by the end of this video, you should know exactly how to change any setting on your X100V. Now, I am going to go over every single setting that I use on the camera, so if there is only one or two things that you want to know about, have a look in the description. I'm going to put some timestamps down there, and you can just guide yourself to the right part of the video for you, and I'm not wasting any of your time. So with that being said, grab your X100V, grab yourself a cup of tea, and let's get started. Okay, so very quickly before we start, I just want to go over what all of the buttons on the camera do. So on top here, you've got your shutter speed dial, which controls your shutter speed, and turning it to A just means it is in automatic mode, so the camera will decide on a shutter speed for you. Inside that dial, if we lift the side up and then turn it, we have this little window here, which is where we set our ISO speed. Again, putting this on A, we'll just put it on automatic for you. And then on the front, we have this little ring that we turn using these little handles here. And this is setting our aperture. And again, putting this on A means it is in automatic mode. Now, while I do think that everyone should shoot in a manual mode, if you are just starting with photography and you've just picked up the X100V, I would definitely recommend just shooting in automatic for a bit. To do that, make sure all of these 3 A's are selected. If you are shooting in manual, you will learn faster, but if you don't know what you are doing, you will also just get really confused really fast, and it will probably put you off taking photos. So there is no shame in using the automatic modes when you're just starting out. Here we have the shutter button to take photos, to half press to focus. We have the on-off switch. We have a custom function button here, and the exposure compensation dial, which when you have got your camera in a automatic mode, this dial here will make your photos lighter or darker. We have the drive button on the back. We have the auto exposure lock button on the back. We have a dial at the back here which can be customized to different things, and it can also press in and serve as a button. We have the joystick, which also presses in and can be used as a button. Menu button to access the menus. Play button to show you your photographs. And there is a back button here which will also cycle through different displays if you are in the shooting mode. At the front here we have another dial, and we also have a lever with a button here. The button is a custom button, so you can set it to what you want. And this little lever, by moving the lever to the right hand side, it will turn on or off the EVF screen, which basically just turns this from a clear screen to a digital screen. And if we push the lever the other way while we're looking through this, you can see that it pops up this mini EVF screen inside the viewfinder. Okay, so onto the menus. We have different sections here down the side. I'm just going to go through all these individual sections. So starting at the top with the image quality setting. The first option we have is image size. This is the size and aspect ratio of the JPEG files that the camera takes. I have this set to large and 3:2. 3:2 uses the whole sensor. You can crop it down to 16:9, which will give you like a more narrow sort of aspect ratio, or you can use 1:1, which makes your image a square. So basically you'll only be shooting with a square in the middle of the screen, a little bit like that. But all it really does is just crop the JPEG files. So I like to use 3:2, and then you can always crop in post. So the image quality setting is more like the file type. So we have 5 settings here. We have raw, which is just a raw image. We have normal and raw, which is a normal quality JPEG and the raw file. We have fine and raw, which is a better quality JPEG and the raw file. And then we have normal, which is just a normal JPEG, and fine, which is a better quality JPEG. I like to use fine and raw. This is saving the best quality JPEG and a raw file that you can edit afterwards. Raw recording is basically just choosing the file size of the raw file. There's not a huge difference in quality at all. Uncompressed is slightly better quality, but you get a much bigger file size. Lossless compressed means that there isn't as much data in the raw file, but you get a much smaller file size. I choose lossless compressed I don't feel like the massive file size of uncompressed is worth it, to be honest. Everything else in the image quality section, we're talking film simulation, the grain effects, all of this stuff. This is what is referred to as the film recipe. If you go online to a site like Fuji X Weekly, you will find these film recipes, which are basically just presets, or to put it simply, like filters for your photos inside your camera. However, unlike your standard Instagram or Snapchat filters, these are much more customizable, and to be honest, this is one of the main selling points of the Fujifilm cameras. So depending on what look you want to go for, these will change, but I'll quickly go through them and explain what they all do. Film simulation is changing the basic colors of the image. These are based on different film stocks. So you've got stuff like Velvia, which is a really vivid, high saturation profile that is great for shooting like flowers, landscape and stuff. And then you've got other things like Classic Chrome is meant to replicate old film. Classic Negative, to me, replicates more like disposable camera film. And then you've got a couple of black and white ones at the bottom. And you have Sepia, which nobody should ever use, so I'm going to ignore that. Underneath this, we have monochromatic color. So for this, we need to select a monochrome filter. And what this will do will basically just add a tint onto this so we can make our black and white photos look more blue, or make them look a little bit warmer. Or we can add something like a green tint, for example. Next up, we have grain effect. This adds a film grain to your photos. You get two different choices, strong and weak, which are basically just how much grain. You also get a choice of the size of the grain. Color chrome effect, while it doesn't seem like it does that much, it just basically makes your colors a bit more punchy and saturated in your image. It also kind of darkens certain colors and stuff like that. This gives a bit more of a film look effect. Color chrome affects blue. This does the same kind of thing, but it only affects the blue tones. If you would like darker skies in your photos, you can choose strong. If you want lighter skies in your photos, you can choose off. White balance just sets the white balance of the photo. If you go on any of these and you move right on the joystick, it will open up a section where you can then tint the white balance to taste. This is really great for creating certain looks for film recipes. Dynamic range affects the contrast in your shot. 100 will add contrast and 400 will lower the contrast and increase the dynamic range of the image. Be aware that if you do shoot on 400, your ISO will bottom out at 640, meaning that you can't go lower than 640 when you're shooting. With 200, this drops to 320, and on 100, your base ISO can go down to 160. Dynamic range priority just makes the dynamic range choice automatic. Tone curve acts like a tone curve would in Lightroom. So you have a little graph of the curve here. I didn't realize that you could use a touchscreen for that. That's pretty cool. But you can adjust these values here. Adding a plus on the highlights will make the highlights brighter. Adding a negative value will make the highlights darker. I don't know if you can see like on this bit of reflection on the table here. It's kind of retaining some detail on the highlights when we're in the negative numbers, and it's boosting the highlights when we're in positive numbers. Same goes for shadows. Adding a plus number will make the shadows darker, like so, and going with a minus number will make the shadows lighter. You can see if I flick between -2 and +4 there, the difference that is making to the image. Color is basically just the saturation of your photo, how bright the colors are. Sharpness is how sharp your image is. I would recommend putting this on -4 because otherwise the shots look a little bit over sharpened and a little bit too digital for my liking. Noise reduction reduces grain in your images, but it also makes your images look a little bit smooth and a little bit weird. So I would recommend putting this to -4 and just embracing the grain. Clarity, if you put this down, it makes your photos look a little bit more dreamy, and if you put a positive value, it makes them look a little bit more gritty and punchy. I'll show an example on screen now of how it works in Lightroom, just because it's easier than showing you on the camera. Just be aware that if you use any other value than 0, when you go to take a photo on the camera, it will come up with this little box, like it has to load in between each photo, I guess, while it's applying the clarity setting. If you turn that off, and you go to take a photo, it will just take normally. There is no delay. So unless you really want this look, I'd recommend leaving this on 0. Long exposure noise reduction, again, just reduces the grain in your image. I would leave it off. Color space, I would set this to sRGB for 99% of situations. If you're commercially printing your images, I would choose Adobe RGB. But if you have it on Adobe RGB and you put your images on a computer, the colors are going to look really weird. So for 99% of the time, I would just leave this on sRGB. Pixel mapping is a feature used to combat what are called hot pixels, which is basically where a pixel on your sensor dies. This then shows up typically as a red or white dot on your image and can be quite distracting. Pixel mapping will basically just digitally remove that pixel from the sensor. So if you do have an issue with hot pixels at any time, this is a handy feature. And then going back to the film recipe thing, once you've got all of these settings set right how you want them for a certain look, you can go at the bottom here and click Edit or Save Custom Setting. And here is where you will save the recipe as part of your camera settings. I'm going to show you how to do this later when we talk about the buttons, but I've got my custom button set so that I can just scroll through my recipes like this. And this will change all of the settings that we've just talked about depending on the look that you want. Okay, so that is the first section done. Let's move on to AF/MF setting, which is autofocus and manual focus. So first up, we have the focus area, which basically just chooses the point of where you want to put your autofocus. This is much easier done just by pressing the joystick in when you're shooting, and that will select the point for autofocus. For example, if I put it on the corner of my laptop here and I focus, the camera will lock focus on the corner of my laptop. If I put it here on the table and I focus it, it will focus on the table. AF mode cycles through the different types of focus area. I would put this on all, which means that when you go to select your focus point, you can just turn this wheel on the back and it will cycle through them all rather than having to go into the menus. If you have it on something like zone, for example, and you put it over an area of your image, if you half press the shutter, it will just decide where in that zone that it should focus. A lot of the time it gets it wrong, so I would maybe recommend using more of the single point ones. AFC custom settings cycles through different modes for the continuous autofocus. I don't really use this on this camera because I don't think the continuous autofocus is very good, but there's some different purposes here. For example, pick this one if you are shooting a subject that is accelerating or decelerating. It's pretty self-explanatory, but yeah, I don't really use this feature. Store AF mode by orientation is really handy if you shoot portraits because it means that when you turn the camera on the side, it will automatically put the autofocus point to the last point that you had when you had your camera on the side. So for example here, when I turn my camera to the side, it will move the autofocus to the point where I usually position the subject's face. AF point display, I would leave this on. If you're shooting with a wider thing like zone and you focus, it will put like a little green box in the area where it's actually focusing on, which is pretty useful, so just keep that on. Number of focus points, I would just leave this on 425 because it gives you a lot more choice when you are selecting your focus point. But be aware that if you have this on a zone mode, you don't have the option. It will default to 117 and not let you change it. Pre-AF is a feature where the autofocus will be focusing all of the time to make sure that when you are ready to take the photo, it's already in focus. I don't use this and it will use a lot of battery if you do choose to use this, so I would keep it off. AF illuminator is that kind of annoying thing with digital cameras where when you go to focus, it will shine a light from the front of your camera to assist with autofocus. I've never really had an issue with autofocus, so I'll leave this off. Face and eye detection setting. This is great if you're shooting portraits of people, you can put face detection on, but personally, I just leave this off. I don't really use that feature. AF/MF is a feature where if you have your camera in autofocus mode and you focus, you can then manual focus to adjust that focus. I find the autofocus is pretty reliable, so I leave this off. Manual focus assist. I'm going to be honest, I think the manual focusing on this camera is pretty awful. It's not an enjoyable experience at all, so I don't really use it. But these are some different modes that will assist you with manual focus to make sure that you've got the shot really sharp. Personally, if I was using it, I would use the focus peak highlight. As you can see here, when things are in focus, it's making them blue on the screen, so you can easily see what is in focus and what's not. But again, I just use the autofocus, so it's not really relevant for how I shoot. Focus check is a feature that when you manual focus, it will zoom into the image again so you can check the focus, but I don't use that. Interlock, spot, AE and focus area. When you are using spot autofocus, it will meter from the focus area that you have set. For example here, it would take a meter reading from inside this little box. I don't use spot metering, but if you did, it would be handy, so I would leave this on. Instant AF setting. Quite honestly, I don't know what this does, but I don't use continuous, so I leave this on AFS. Depth of field scale, I would leave this on pixel. It's more accurate if you do use a depth of field scale. Release or focus priority is the setting that determines whether if a camera can't get focus, whether it will just take the shot anyway. Personally, I leave this on release. But if you put it on focus, it means that the camera will physically not take a shot unless the image is in focus. Personally, I just think that it's easier to just take a second shot, so I leave this on release. So moving on to the final page of the AF settings, we have the AF range limiter. This will restrict the range of the autofocus so that the autofocus can get focus faster. But to be honest, it's quite an advanced feature. Unless you really know what you're doing with it, I would just leave it off. Touchscreen mode, I have this off because I don't like using the touchscreen for shooting, and also my left eye goes here, which means that my nose ends up touching the touchscreen all the time and it's a bit annoying. So I turn this off, but there are 4 different modes. Off, area, which means that when you tap on a certain area of the screen, it will move the focus point to that point. AF does the same thing, but will also focus the image rather than just setting the place where you put the point. And touch shooting means that when you tap the screen, it will take an image instead of pressing the shutter button. But yeah, I just leave this off. Corrected AF frame is for if you're using the OVF feature, which is when you look through that there isn't a screen, you can just see straight through. This isn't perfectly in line with the lens, so it means that there is what is called a parallax effect, and the corrected AF frame just makes it easier to combat the parallax effect. So I would leave that on. So moving on to the third menu, this little camera, which is shooting settings. First up, we have Sports Finder mode. I leave this off. What it is basically when you're shooting, it will put a little box in the middle of your screen and it will show you what's outside of that box. So say if you're shooting something sporty, which is where the name comes from, say if you're shooting a footballer and something happens outside your frame, you can see it and then you can adjust your framing accordingly. But basically what it does on this camera is just crop into the JPEG files. So you're best off just leaving it off. Shoot in the JPEG like as the whole frame, and then you can crop into it in post if you need to. Self timer, I have this off unless I'm taking a selfie and then I'll put it on 10 seconds. Or if I'm using it on a tripod, I'll put it on 2 seconds, just because when you press the shutter, as you can see, the camera's moving. I mean, this is a pretty bad tripod, but you see that the camera's moving. If you put it on 2 seconds and press the shutter, it gives the camera 2 seconds to sort of calm down, stop wobbling, and you'll get sharper shots. But for everything handheld, leave this off. Save self-timer setting, I turn this off. It basically means that if you put the self-timer on 2 seconds and you take a photo, if the save self-timer setting is on, it will stay on self-timer. If the save self-timer setting is off, it will reset back to normal shooting. I just keep this off, but it depends what you want. Interval timer shooting is so you can shoot a time lapse on the camera, which is really handy. You basically choose how long you want between each photograph and how many photographs it will take. And then when you press the shutter, it will just kind of take a photo, for example, every 1 minute. Interval timer shooting exposure smoothing, bit of a mouthful. What this does is it will adjust your exposure when you're shooting time lapses. So for example, if you're shooting a time lapse of a sunset, when the sky gets darker, the camera will adjust accordingly for this. I would leave this on. Auto exposure bracket setting. This is for if you are exposure bracketing. If you don't know what that is, then just ignore it. And if you do know what that is, then these will kind of make sense to you. It basically just decides the sequence in how you want to auto exposure bracket your scene. If I was auto exposure bracketing, I would just leave this on the settings that it comes with by default. Next up, we have film simulation bracketing. What this will do is every time you take a photo, it will save 3 copies of that photo, each one with a different film simulation. I don't use this feature for the simple reason that if you're looking at any of your photos on the camera and you are shooting RAW and JPEG, which I would definitely recommend doing, if you press this Q button on the side, it will open up a RAW conversion menu, and what you can do here is you can go to the film simulation and you can change it there, along with all of the other settings from the recipe. So if you want to completely change the recipe and effectively edit it in camera, you can, and then when you press Q again, it will make a new version of that photo with the new settings. So for that reason, I don't use the film simulation bracket because you can just change it anywhere. However, if you're shooting JPEG, this might come in handy, but I wouldn't recommend only shooting JPEG personally. I always think that it's good to have at least a backup of the RAW files, as these are much more flexible. For example, if you overexpose or underexpose your image, you can save it with the RAW file. Next up, we have focus bracket setting. This will basically do the same thing. It will take a number of photos and it will change the focus. This is good for if you're focus stacking. If you don't know what focus stacking is, don't worry about it. It's quite an advanced technique, and I've honestly never used it. Moving on to the second page, first up we have multiple exposure control. So first up, I'm going to show you how to access the multiple exposure function. We want to click Drive and Delete up here, and this will basically give us a menu with loads of settings. We can have still image, which is just taking a normal photo. We've got our burst modes here and our bracket modes here. And then if we scroll down to advanced, we have the option to make a panorama, and scrolling across, we have the option to do a multiple exposure. Now what this is you can take one photograph like that and then click next. And then when you move the camera, it will show you the other photograph, and you can take another shot. And then you will have what is called a multiple exposure, where two images are overlaid on one frame. Here's a few cool examples of some multiple exposures to show you the kind of thing that you can do with this setting. So going back to the multiple exposure control setting, this just decides on how you want to expose the second, third, fourth exposure. There are loads of videos online that will tell you what all of these things mean. It's quite an advanced technique, and to be honest, I'm not very experienced with it, but every time I've done it, I've used average and it's worked out great for me. Photometry is the metering mode. Personally, I leave this on multi. Shutter type decides on whether to use the mechanical or the electronic shutter. As a general rule, mechanical shutter is better. Electronic shutter can fire a little bit faster, because the mechanical shutter can only fire at 1/4000th of a second. So if you were shooting in really, really bright daylight and you had your aperture opened all the way up, you will run into a problem on the camera where the image might look great on the back of the screen, but when you take the photo, it'll be too bright. This is something that was really frustrating when I first got this camera, and I didn't realise what the problem was. So now I set my shutter type to mechanical and electronic, and what that means is if the mechanical shutter isn't fast enough, it will switch to the electronic shutter. Flicker reduction reduces the flicker and banding in images that are shot under artificial light. I just leave this off unless you're really having a problem with flicker. I don't think I've ever ran into that problem on this camera, so yeah, I just leave it off. ISO auto setting. So on most cameras, you choose a minimum and a maximum value for the automatic ISO. On Fuji cameras, it's pretty cool. They give you 3 different options. So for each one, you can scroll across and you can choose the lowest, the maximum, and a minimum shutter speed. And then you can have 3 different options for this. So I have these set up for 3 different things. Auto 1 maxes out at 800. Auto 2 maxes out at 6400. And for really low light situations, Auto 3 maxes out at 12,800. I mainly keep it on Auto 2, but if I really needed 0 grain in my images, I would put it down to Auto 1, which maxes out at 800. Conversion lens, this is a setting that you can add on if you add on the wide conversion or the teleconversion lenses. In the Mark II versions of these lenses, it will automatically set this setting for you, so you probably don't need to worry about this. But if you are using the older wide converter or the older teleconverter, you will have to go in the menu and choose which one you're using. Digital teleconverter basically just crops into your image to make it look like a 50mm or a 70mm lens. It also upscales your image a little bit, but I just leave this off. If I really only wanted like a small portion of my frame to be in the shot, I would just move closer or I would just crop in post. Be aware as well that this only affects the JPEG files. If you shoot RAW on 70mm, when you put it in Lightroom or something like that, it will default back to the wide setting. And at the bottom here we have ND filter. For people that don't know, this is basically just sunglasses for your lens so that you can use slower shutter speeds in really bright light. You can turn this on or off here, but personally I have it set to the button on the front of the camera, so when I press it, it turns the ND filter on, and pressing it again turns it off. Just be aware that if you have this on indoors, it cuts all of the exposure to an image. So say you were shooting outside and you put the ND filter on, and then you went back inside, you would have to compensate for that with a lower shutter speed or a higher ISO value, which means that your image will be either motion blurred or very grainy. It's really hard to miss this little ND thing up here. I've definitely done it before where I've been shooting outside and walked back inside and forgot to turn the ND filter off. So just be aware of this little symbol here at the top and make sure you turn it off when you go back into a low light situation. Finally, at the bottom here, we have wireless communication, which will connect your camera to your phone so that you can transfer images. Moving on to menu number 4, which is the flash settings. So first off, if you want to use the flash, you're going to need to make sure that built-in flash is turned on. And when you're using a flash on top of your camera, you need to make sure that built-in flash is turned off. Honestly, I think this is really annoying. I think that if you have got a flash on top, it should automatically turn this off. And if you haven't, it should automatically turn it on. Because when we go into the flash function setting here, there is a second option to turn the built-in flash on or off. So I don't know why there's two settings here. It's pretty confusing. So I would just leave this built-in flash setting on at the bottom here. And this flash function menu is where you go if you want to turn the flash on and off. So by default, it will be off. If you scroll this little wheel here, it will turn it on and it will put it in TTL mode. And then when you scroll across here, you can decide on the power of the flash. Scrolling across again, here we'll put the flash on manual mode, and here you can manually choose the power of the flash. 164 means 1/64th of the power. 1.1 means that it's on full power. 1.2 means that it's on half power. This final setting here, I'm assuming it's if you're using a flash gun. I don't have a Fujifilm flash gun, I have a different one, so I don't use this setting. This little sync thing here decides whether you want the flash to go at the beginning or the end of your exposure. This is more important if you were using like a 1-second exposure, for example, because if you have it at the front, it will flash and then keep the shutter open for a second. If you have it at the rear, it will take the photo for a second and then flash at the end. Red eye removal, if you want to do this, I would recommend doing it in post as it's much better than doing it in camera, so I would leave this off. TTL lock mode, if I'm going to be honest, I don't know what this does, I would just leave it on last flash. And then these settings that are greyed out here, I'm assuming these are if you're using like an official Fujifilm flash, but I don't have one, so I've never been able to use any of these options. Moving on to the 5th menu, here we have the movie settings. I'm going to be honest, I don't really think the X100V is very good for movie shooting, but I'll go through these really quickly. Movie mode here is choosing your image quality. So this is cycling through our image sizes. So we have, for example, 4K, which shoots 4K video. We have full HD, which is a little bit bigger than normal HD. We have full HD, which is just standard 1080 HD. And then we have DCI, which is a slightly different version of 4K. We also have our frame rates here, so we can use 23, 24, 25. There is the option to shoot at 50 frames a second and 60 frames a second, but we have to go onto HD mode to unlock those. It won't shoot these at 4K. And then this is the bitrate of your footage. I would just keep this on the highest. Full HD high-speed recording are your slow motion modes. And then these little settings here are basically just your film recipe that you want to apply to shooting the video. This is separate to your ones in the iQOO. It's the same settings, but it's just a separate option for them. And then at the bottom here, you've got like your movie outputs and you've got HDMI control, stuff like that. I honestly wouldn't use this camera as a video camera, so I'm going to skip over these. If you do want to use it as a video camera, there are loads of really good videos online that will explain this way better than what I can. And finally, we have the setup option, which is arguably the most important. So first up, we have user setting, and the first option is format. Click this if you want to format your memory card, but be aware that this will delete everything on your memory card, and there is a very small chance that if you format it, you'll ever get any of that stuff back. So only do this if you are 100% sure that you don't want any of the files on your camera or you have them all backed up elsewhere. Date and time, pretty self-explanatory, sets the date and time. Language, obviously I've used English. My menu setting is a little option which will show up at the bottom here. And any options that you choose all of the time. So for example, if you are always changing your AF point display setting, you can click that and it will add it to a quick menu. Then when you go down at the bottom here, you can access your custom menu, and everything that you've saved in this menu will be there for quick changes. Personally, I don't use this because I think there's enough custom buttons on the camera that you can just use everything that you need anyway. But if there is some stuff that you change all the time, it's a really handy feature. Shutter count will show you how many photos that your X100V has taken in total. You cannot reset this. Think of it a lot like the mileage on a car. The more shots it's taken, the more the camera has been used. This is pretty handy if you're buying a second-hand camera, but quite honestly, I think you could probably shoot 100,000 to 200,000 photos on this camera and it probably wouldn't have any issues. So don't worry about it too much. However, if you find one that has only taken 1,000 photos, for example, you know that it's barely ever been used. Sound and flash is basically like putting your camera on silent mode. I leave this on because you can turn the sound off anyway. And reset, I'm assuming that resets all settings on your camera. I don't want to click on that. Regulatory is just some information that they need to display. Moving on to sound setup. AF beep volume, I turn this off because I think it's really annoying. Self-timer beep volume, I keep this on medium because it's quite handy if you are using the self-timer. Operation volume, I turn off because I don't like it to make loads of noise when I'm scrolling through menus. Shutter volume, so by default it actually has a shutter click on the camera, which I think sounds pretty cheap and awful, so I turn this off. But if you do want it on, you can change the sound of your shutter. I think they all sound pretty awful, to be honest, so again, I would just leave this off. Playback volume is for the playback sound of video. Next up, we have screen setup. View mode setting, I like to keep on the eye sensor, which means that when I put my eye to the sensor, it will turn the screen off and it will put the EVF on inside the camera, like so. Bright frame position memory, it's quite complicated to explain what this is, but it's basically for when you're using the OVF, like when you're looking through and you can just see straight through this viewfinder here. The frame of your photo will move around depending on how close you focus due to something called the parallax effect. And what this does is if it moves closer, it will just keep it closer. I've not explained that very well, but honestly just leave it on. EVF brightness adjusts the brightness inside the screen. EVF color adjusts the amount of saturation in there. And the colour adjustment will tint it either red or blue. When I bought the camera, I realised that the EVF, like the colours in it, were a little bit off. So I've adjusted mine so that it matches my screen. And again, I've adjusted the LCD here so that it matches the EVF. The best way to do this is to take a photo and look at it on your computer and then adjust these accordingly depending on how it looks on your computer. I think for most people, you probably just need to leave this on 0. I think my camera was a little bit defected from the factory, so that was why I've had to adjust it. Image display is basically the setting, so when you take a photo, it will display the image either half a second, 1.5 second, or continuously on the screen. Personally, I'll leave this off. Auto rotate displays means that when you turn the camera into portrait mode, it will turn all of the numbers around too. I leave this on. Preview exposure and white balance in manual mode, just leave this on. This just means that when you are adjusting your exposure, you will see the changes on the back of the screen, which is what you want. Natural live view is the opposite of this, so if you put natural live view on, it will basically just treat the screen like how a DSLR screen works, where no matter how you change the settings, it will just show you a general good exposure on the screen, but then when you take the photo, it will apply the settings. The only time that I would use this is if I was using flash, because obviously if you're using flash, when you press the shutter, the flash is going to flash and that will change the exposure from what you're seeing on the screen. So if you were doing any sort of studio work or flash work, I would turn this on. For everything else, just leave it off. Framing guideline just puts this little grid that you can see here over the screen. Personally, I have this on grid 9, but you can choose whichever one that you prefer. Auto rotate playback means that when you are viewing images on your camera, if you tilt the camera to the side, it will rotate them. Personally, I don't like this, so I leave this off. Focus scale units, this chooses between meters or feet. I prefer meters. OVF image display, this is to do with when you're shooting with the OVF. If you have the option enabled where it shows you the photo for a second after, it will pop up the full screen to show you that photo if you have it on full screen, or if you have it on small window, it will only pop up the little tiny screen and just show you a small preview of it. Personally, I use full. Display custom setting decides on what information you want around your screen. Large indicators are good if you have poor vision. You can put large indicators on so that it just means that everything around your screen will be a little bit bigger. Personally, I have this off. You could customize this further on the large indicators display setting here. Information contrast adjust at the bottom here. This is basically like a theme for your camera. So you can see when you cycle through the different options, there's different contrast and color modes. You can also have dark ambient lighting, which makes everything on your X100V this red tone, which kind of looks pretty cool, but when you go onto the shooting mode, all of your information around the screen is red, and I don't like that. So personally, I leave this on high contrast. So moving on to button and dial setting, this focus lever setting I put on. This means that when you are in this mode, you can push this little stick in here and you can choose your focus points. Edit and quick save menu, let me just show you how to access that. The quick save menu here is accessed by pressing the Q button when you're shooting. And what it will do is it will bring up a series of boxes that you can scroll along, and then you can turn this dial on the back here to cycle through the individual settings. I don't use this that much, to be honest with you, but here are my settings that I use. I use 8 slots. In the first one, I have select custom setting. If you want to change these, just click and you can, choose between the things that you want on here. I have photometry, image quality, shutter type, EVF LCD brightness, self-timer, flash compensation, and flash function setting. The Q menu background I like to keep transparent. Basically, that's just when you press the Q button, whether you want this background to show, what your camera can see like that, or whether you want it to just be a black screen behind. Moving on to function setting, I feel like this is the most important setting that you should be changing on your camera. So what this does is it sets all of these buttons to do custom things. So I'm going to go through which ones I use. Function button 1, which is the button on top of the camera up here. I have this set to select custom setting, which means that when I'm shooting, if I click this button on the top, it will cycle through my film recipes that I have saved onto my camera. FN2 is the little button at the front that is on the lever. I have this set to my ND filter, so when I press it, it engages my ND filter, and when I press it again, it takes off my ND filter. Here we have some settings called TFN 1, 2, 3, 4. Now to use these, what we need to do is we need to go in our AFMF setting on page number 3 and turn touchscreen mode off. Then we need to go on the wrench again, and we want to go button dial setting and go all the way down to the second page where it says touchscreen setting, and we want to turn this touch function on. And what that means is that you can use certain swipes on the touchscreen as custom buttons. To customize them, we go back to our function setting and touch function 1, so I have swipe up on the touchscreen as my white balance. Swipe left on the touchscreen is flash function setting. This is great if I swipe left. I can then use this dial to cycle through my flash mode and turn my flash on and off through this menu. Number 3, which is a right swipe on the D-pad, I have set to my film simulations. And if I swipe down on the D-pad, it does a focus check, which basically just zooms into the image so that you can check focus. This AEL-AFL button is this one here. Personally, I don't use auto exposure lock, which is set to by default, so I have this set to turn face detection on or off. And the rear dial is pushing in the rear dial, like this. And I have this set to my auto ISO settings. Moving on to the second page, I have my selector just set as ND filter, and the Q button I have set to my Q menu. The command dial setting means that you can use this dial on the back and the dial on the front to change your shutter speed and your ISO if you have the relevant dials set to the C function. I'm going to pause the video here to explain this better than I originally did, since it's pretty confusing and I even confused myself while making the original video. 1, 2 and 3 on this menu are 3 separate settings that you can assign to the front dial. To switch between these while shooting, you can press the dial in like a button and it will cycle between option 1, 2 and 3. Setting 4 on this menu is for the rear dial. Since the rear dial is a custom button, it will only let you have one option set for the rear dial. Now by default, even if we change these settings, while we're shooting, these will all be disabled. We actually need to tell the camera that we want to use the dials. So to make this even more confusing, to do this for the shutter speed, we need to set the shutter speed on the camera on the top dial to T. For the aperture, we need to turn the aperture ring to A. For the ISO, we need to pull up the outer ring and set the ISO to C. And to adjust exposure compensation, we also need to turn the exposure compensation dial to C. Once we do this, we can then use the front and rear dials to change our settings. Shutter AF decides whether if you press the shutter halfway, whether it will focus or not. The only reason that you would turn this off is if you were using back button focus. Shutter AE locks your exposure when you half press the shutter. I have these turned on. And Shoot Without Card chooses whether the camera will take photos even when there's not an SD card in the camera. Moving on to the second page of this, we have Focus Ring. This just decides on which direction you want to turn the focus ring to focus. Focus Ring Operation. This changes it between non-linear and linear. And basically what non-linear means is that if you turn it fast, it will jump from one end of the focus to the other. If you put it on linear, it will be smooth throughout the whole range of focusing. Personally, I don't use manual focus on this camera because I feel like it absolutely sucks, so I just keep this on non-linear. Control ring setting is a pretty handy feature where you can choose to make the focus ring on the lens into effectively a second button. You can use it to scroll between white balances, film simulations, or digital teleconversion lengths. I do find though that it's really easy to knock this when you shoot just in everyday situations, so I turn mine off. AE/AF lock mode, I leave mine on P. AWB lock mode, I leave mine on P. You can turn these off, but it means that you will need to use the auto exposure lock to lock your exposure. Aperture ring setting A, just leave this on automatic. It means that when you put your aperture ring to A, then it will just be automatic. Please note that if you would like to control the aperture with the front dial, you need to set this to command. And touchscreen setting, we've been through this, but I would just leave them all on. And lock setting just locks all of your settings so you can't accidentally change them. This is great if you lend the camera to a friend or something like that. Moving on to power management here, auto power off, I keep this on 2 minutes because sometimes I forget to turn my camera off and it uses a lot of battery if you just leave it on. So performance, we have two options here, normal or boost. Boost improves the camera focus speed and the viewfinder display performance, but it does mean that the battery drains much faster than if you were just using normal mode. I honestly feel like the camera is fast enough and the autofocus is fast enough in normal mode, so to save battery I just leave mine in normal. But I guess if you have loads of spare batteries and you want the very best performance from your camera, you can put this on boost. Auto power off temperature, I would set this to high. It just means that if your camera gets hot, it won't turn off straight away. I don't feel like using high is dangerous for the camera at all, so I would just set it to high. Save data setup is about how your camera saves files on your memory card. I would just leave all this on default settings. And connection settings are basically just settings that are used to decide how your camera connects to your phone or your computer. Again, I would just leave all of these on the settings that it comes with automatically. If you do want to connect your phone to your camera, you want to go in the Bluetooth settings here and you want to register it to your phone using the pairing registration option. So that is pretty much it. We've been through every single setting on the camera. If you're still here, thank you so much for sticking around. I hope you've enjoyed it and I will see you in the next one.